It's 30 years since the Great Storm of 1987. We're here in the Met Office to have a little bit of a chat about that with, I'm not afraid of using the word, legend, Michael Fish. Mike, let's just start with the day itself. What are your memories of the big day?
Well, of course, it started off lovely and ended up horrendous. I was on the morning shift, so I was giving the lunchtime broadcast and then going home. The lunchtime broadcast was the infamous one, of course, which has gone down in history and made me a millionaire, if only. But at that time, I was happy, everybody was happy. I had projected the story as per the senior forecaster, and that was it, fine. And I saw Bill Giles in the evening talking about it being a little bit breezy up the channel, so again, we thought everything going to plan, fine. And then I normally get up about 3:30 to come back to work, but earlier than that, strange noises. There was howling, and my television area was doing all sorts of funny things.
So you were on the morning shift, so that starts at what, 5 o'clock in the morning?
5 o'clock in the morning.
You had to be
at
work, right? And you'd finished. It was the lunchtime.
Yeah.
Pretty much the last thing you did on shift that day.
That's right. And then you go home, knock off at about 2:30, something like that. And then I went home and was about to start do the same thing again, getting up at 3:30, starting work at 5. But before that, about 2:30 in the morning, this horrendous noise outside. And I went out in the back garden to find a tree leaning over, the television area at a crazy angle. So I thought, oh dear, ho, 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 ho. But it never occurred to me that it was anything mega. I thought perhaps it was just a local downdraft or something like that. So I went back to sleep for an hour and then drove to work. But because I drove to work on a wide road with dual carriageway, no trees, no nothing, I got to work and unsuspecting, it still didn't know anything.
Still hadn't realised.
And it was about 10 o'clock in the morning after I'd been there for 4 or 5 hours. The news stories started to trickle through and my phone started to ring, and then I thought, oh dear.
So it was actually more the day after, really,
it was a long time
things
after.
Really started to dawn on everyone.
Well, it was the day, but where I was, isolated in the television centre, we were a one-man band. We had this broom cupboard. We worked the camera, the lighting, the vision, the makeup and everything. And I was literally there, totally on my own from 5 o'clock through till, as I say, the phone started ringing at 9 or 10 o'clock with tales of woe from the staff who were trying to get in and various other things like that.
And then when, because I guess initially that was all about the weather and all about, when or how much later was it when people started highlighting your forecast from the previous day?
Well, that wasn't until the afternoon.
Right.
I hadn't realised at all, of course. It never dawned on me that I made a stupid remark. And so I went home completely oblivious. And about 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a reporter appeared on my door. And that was when I twigged that something had gone a little bit adrift. And by the end of the day and the next morning, there must be about 50 of them camped outside, desperately wanting a story. But because I was only a little junior civil servant, not really allowed to talk to the press, I had to, well, not reluctantly, very sensibly, kept them at bay and never spoke to them. And because it was a weekend, in those days the Met Office didn't have a press office and certainly had nobody working at the weekend. So in a way that's probably why the press just went away and made up some pretty horrendous stories, because there was nobody to speak to.
So it all drifted over the weekend and it got bigger and bigger and snowballed.
That's right. And there was nobody in the Met Office to stand up for themselves.
You talk about a tree down in your back garden or a bent. Was that the worst, actually, you personally being affected by it?
It wasn't a very big tree, and my wife put it back up again.
Oh, did she? Okay.
She's good at that. But there was a major tree further down the road that I didn't know about until the next day.
So the big question, I guess, is do you regret what you said and the nature of that forecast? Or?
No, not really. I don't know. I mean, it was quite a genuine remark, and it wasn't as the press thought. I was actually referring to something that was happening in Florida. And what's amusing is this story about the lady from Wales. There never was a lady from Wales. That was complete and utter fabrication. I had been talking in the studio with the cameraman about hurricanes, and his parents were about to go to Florida.
Right.
And I had reassured him that there wasn't going to be a hurricane in Florida, and it sort of got stuck in my mind.
Okay.
And that's how the hurricane remark came out.
Yes, well, there's been a lot of repercussions, I guess, since then. I mean, you carried on working for the Met Office for almost 20 years after that as well. I mean, what changes did you see in that time?
The changes are vast. I mean, from when I joined the Met Office, it was a pencil and rubber. That was the best computer we had. By the time we got to 87, we did have numerical forecasts.
Yeah.
And we did have computer graphics at the BBC.
Yes, but I think,
since then, things have...
supercomputer back in 87 was about as powerful as a smartphone
yes, exactly.
Nowadays,
exactly.
whereas the one we have now in the Met Office...
And it was vast, about the size of a bus.
Yeah.
You couldn't carry it around with you in your pocket. Yeah, oh yes, and now with supercomputers we're getting accurate, or I think accurate forecasts. 15 days or so in advance.
Here at the Met Office we have the most powerful weather supercomputer in the world. It does 16,000 trillion calculations a second or something.
Absolutely.
Like that.
I was reading on the train coming down how many observations go into it at the moment.
Yeah, that's another thing as well, because in 87 there were some satellites, right, but not on the extent that we have now.
And of course there was a great big gap of no observations around the Bay of Biscay, which is where it all developed.
Really formed.
And that's been plugged now by having buoys out there.
So observations on the ground and just the number of satellites that we have now. So you would actually nowadays be able to see it develop.
They're in the billions and say, oh yes, I would have thought so. Yes.
And
although it was really fast, of course, it did.
Yes.
It took some catching up, keeping up to it.
Of course, yeah, it was moving so quickly and just intensified so rapidly, just in the wrong part of the world, really, in terms of population.
But we had another one a few years later, Burnside Storm.
Yes.
And that was exceedingly well handled.
Yes. Yeah, it was 1990?
Yes, I think it was 1990.
Yeah, so it was only a few years later, very sort of similar development.
And very well handled, and forecast a long time in advance. Well, actually, the Great Storm was forecast a long time in advance.
Yeah.
That's the problem on the farming forecast. And earlier in the week it was talked about and accurately predicted, but then it slowly got changed as the week went on, and the track was slowly moved further and further south. And
another more recent example, of course, the St Jude's Day storm, which was again a similar kind of rapidly developing thing, and that's another one of the big changes that we've seen. On the back of that, we now name our storms, of course, to raise awareness,
which is good. But I bet they'll never name one Michael.
I don't know, Mike. I don't know. Maybe they will. Maybe they will. If we get to M one year, though, we've had a bad year, right?
Yeah, a very bad year.
That's the problem. Maybe we just call it fish, and then there's a better chance of getting to F. But that does raise awareness in the public. That's why the Met Office name the storms now. And so the St Jude's Day storm was particularly impressive. I remember being amazed because we started to issue a warning for it like 5 days before, and it was one of those ones, again, it hadn't formed at all. It was forming on the day, and yet the computers were suggesting, knew it was going to happen so far in advance. We were so confident that we started issuing warnings about 5 days before.
And I think the major storm was very much like we've got at the moment, because there was some remnants of an old hurricane, some tropical air mixed in with it, which helped the...
Well, it always gives extra energy, doesn't it? If it's got a tropical storm, it's got that extra energy.
Now, of course, we're talking at the end of September.
Yes.
And we've got 2 hurricanes out there on the Atlantic about to get sucked up by another
Atlantic. And it's the time of year because hurricanes are much more prevalent in September, October as well. We've talked quite a lot about how computer power has moved on, but also the way we forecast and the different types of computer models now. How many computer models were there in 1987?
I think 2. One we called the coarse mesh,
and
one we called the fine mesh.
They did what they said on the tin. One was much more detailed than the other one.
Yeah.
We have a sort of similar setup now, but of course we have many more models, and of course we can share information more easily now with the French, for example, and with the Americans. We all model the weather right around the globe, and there's a lot more interaction.
Yes, I noticed that with the 2 hurricanes that we've had recently, how the British model and the ECWMF model were both being used, and in fact turning out to be perhaps more accurate than
here at the Met Office,
American models.
We work very closely with the National Weather Service in the US to help them out and create the best forecast that's possible. But nowadays you have so many more computer models.
Well, what I find incredible is how far in advance you can forecast.
Yes.
There's some reasonable idea now up to, I believe it's sort of 15 days ahead, which is incredible because if you think about it, that means to say the computer is actually inventing things out of the blue that aren't there,
even there,
and that no human being would ever have forecast, because it just wasn't there.
Yes, that's incredible, because the atmosphere changes so much in 15 days, doesn't it? How far in advance could you go in 87?
3 to 5 days.
3 to 5 days.
I think.
We could talk for hours, if not days, about all the different statistics come out of the 87 Great Storm. One of the biggest, I suppose, in terms of the number, and it sort of draws your attention, is the actual cost, estimated to be around £1 billion in the space of about 2 hours that night. It's incredible to think about how much devastation Mother Nature can cause.
Absolutely. And look at the devastation in the Caribbean.
Yes.
This year, I mean, it's terrible, really.
Strong winds just reaping havoc.
The force of nature.
The force of nature.
Uncontrollable.
Yes, and again, it's one of the reasons why we now have the warnings in force and the position to help protect lives as well as the infrastructure. So it sounds like you actually got away pretty lightly yourself, personally, Mike, with just a slightly bent tree. But obviously, other parts of the southeast were absolutely devastating.
Absolutely, yes. The forests were. I don't know how many million trees it was, but there was a heck of a lot. And at the time, it seemed to be a major disaster. But since then, of course, it has been realised that it was nature's way, and actually, a lot of the forests that were devastated are better for it.
Yeah, it was terrible conditions in the morning in terms of transport getting around. My father-in-law's from Sevenoaks. And he was
One Oak.
8 Oaks now.
I know, I was filming there the other day.
They've replanted them all.
Yeah. You and I have been following each other's footsteps,
we have, yes. Yeah. But he was driving to Luton that day for work.
Yeah.
He got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, set off various sort of side routes that he knew because he had to avoid various trees that were down. And he just said all you could smell was pine. That was his significant memory of the day, just remembering the smell of pine everywhere. And he got about 3 miles, avoiding trees, drove over some power lines, because they were down as well. Yeah. And it was at that point that he realised this was probably not a good idea. Turned around and went back.
Of course, we must also say or realise that not all of it was due to the weather. It was an unfortunate time, wasn't it, for the poor old trees? It had been exceptionally wet, so the roots weren't holding on all that well.
That had weakened a lot of them.
They were still in full leaf. It had been a mild autumn, a late autumn, which didn't help. And they were also zapped from a wrong direction, because the trees are braced for a southwesterly, and this came in more or less from a southeast and got them from behind, as it were.
Yes, yeah, of course people don't really understand or appreciate that subtle differences like that can make a difference. One of the things we do nowadays when we talk about impacts as well, because sometimes a 70-mile-an-hour wind we wouldn't necessarily warn for, depending on the circumstances. If there's been a lot of rain, you're more likely to warn for it because of that fact, because the trees are weaker and it's a greater chance of knocking over. So it's more of a change again in how we look at warnings now, because here at the Met Office we issue warnings based on impacts, and obviously you have to take that kind of thing. Wind direction is another one. Again, just going back to 87, it was such a different time in terms of how people consumed weather forecasts as well. You guys were so famous on the TV and on the radio because you were great, obviously, but of course because that was how people consumed weather. That's how they got their weather, only from radio and TV. Nowadays, so much more opportunities to get your weather.
Flattery gets you everywhere. I mean, our average audience in those days for the main broadcast was 18 million.
Wow.
Now I believe it's not around about 5 or 6 million. So that shows you dropped by 2/3.
Yes, and because people are just getting their weather from
other
social
sources,
media, from
and
online.
there's so many other channels as well.
Yes, of course.
There was just whatever it was, 4 or 5 channels in those days, and now there's hundreds.
Now there's 4 or 5 major social media channels, as well as all the TV, all the radio, and online.
But the weather, the ways we get it now are much better. I mean, to have it on your phone instantly.
Yeah. So obviously there was massive infrastructure problems on the day. People couldn't really get around at all. How long did that take to clear up?
I don't actually remember to the day, but it certainly took an awful long time. I think it must have been a good sort of week, because it happened at the weekend. And I'm sure most of the coming week was disrupted in one way or another.
And of course, far more tragically, there were even fatalities on the day, both in the UK and in France.
There were, but it was lucky, of course, in a way, that it was in the middle of the night. Because you can imagine how many fatalities there would have been if it had been in the middle of the day. In fact, the Burns night storm was in the middle of the day. and more people were killed, unfortunately, in that storm, even though it wasn't quite as vicious as the 87 storm.
Yes. And of course, it's from that's part of the Met Office remit is to protect lives, which is why we've developed the warning system so much more over recent years to flag that up, to draw attention to people.
And you can issue these warnings several days in advance with reasonable confidence now.
Yes.
In the old days, with what was called a flash message, that was issued at the time or even after it had happened in some places. Whereas now, several days in advance, people can be well prepared.
Not only the way we forecast the weather changed dramatically in the 30 years, but the way we actually make presentations has changed dramatically in those years as well. I mean, we're just developing into the computerized side of presenting the weather back in 87, but nowadays we have a much more sort of realistic looking weather map and actually have bands of rain rather than symbols.
Yes, and I think probably the weather is treated with a rather more respect than it was in those days, because we were very much a buffer, a filler, sort of like an advert slot, and you never knew how long you had. And if it was a fine, sunny, dry day, you had 5 minutes. If there was a hurricane on the way, you had 30 seconds.
You could be sure of it.
And you never knew how long you had until you were halfway through the broadcast.
No, that was one of the big skills at that time, wasn't it? Very much flexible, and you had to fill the gap to the end of the news.
Absolutely, but now there's at least a guaranteed 1 minute, 2 minutes.
Yes.
And they can plan what they're going to get into it and get it in.
And of course, you can be, hopefully, ideally, a bit more accurate nowadays as well, because when you used to have weather symbols, I mean, they'd cover, 200 square miles with one symbol, and the weather's just not like that.
And you had a whole 24-hour period just moving one symbol.
Yeah.
That was rain spreading from the west. Plonk. Then it would fall off on the floor, of course.
Well, that was back in the day, wasn't it?
That was in the good old days.
Ones, yes. Whereas nowadays, you can really represent actually what the weather's going to look like and feel like with images as well as the computer graphic.
And I'm quite amazed these days at how you can very easily go to other parts of the world. You've been showing the Caribbean recently.
Yes.
Sometimes it's Australia, sometimes it's the Far East.
Yeah.
We could never do that before.
No, we can zoom around as well. You can sort of actually show the globe and actually show people rather than just a snapshot and cut down to the Caribbean. You can actually fly there and fly over all the satellite imagery again. Just the improvement in the observations from that side, from above and below, with the number of observations.
And the satellite sequence, of course. In my day, the satellite picture was literally a piece of fax paper.
It came through on a fax, did it?
Came through on a fax. And we would then edge the outline of the British Isles with a bit of felt tip pen.
Right.
Clamp it onto an old music stand with some broken magnetic rubber and point to it with a knitting needle.
Really?
That was the technology.
Wow. So we've changed a little bit what's above us, and of course we've changed what's on the ground, looking up.
And what do you think will happen in the next 30 years?
I don't know. What do you think? Do you think we'll have observation centres halfway up through the atmosphere?
I hate to think. In 1987, I'd have never have ever said to myself, I'll be back in 30 years' time, and by that time so much would have changed.
Yeah. We have the benefit of aeroplanes now as well. There's so many more jet planes flying over the Atlantic, and we use their information to send back again to the supercomputer so it can assimilate what's going on in the atmosphere so much better.
I suppose the next move, heaven forbid, would be to control the weather.
Cloud seeding already exists, but with limited success.
It would be the ultimate weapon, though, wouldn't it?
That would be the ultimate weapon. Then we could steer the 87 storm back out in the Atlantic. Okay, well, thanks very much for your memories, Mike.
It's a pleasure. It's nice to see you again after all these years.
Talking to you. Maybe we'll have the same chat in 30 years.
You've got too much blooming hair, that's the problem.
Well, we worked out, didn't we, that I am now
yes, all right, don't rub it in.
Exactly the same age that you were on that famous day back in 87. Yeah, impressive. Okay, well, thanks again for joining us.
Oh, God, I feel old.
We'll do it again in 30 years' time. Thanks for joining us here in the Met Office with a chat about the Great Storm of 1987.